Hayalperestlerin, risk alanların, denemekten korkmayanların cesaretinden doğduk. Bizi asla yarı yolda bırakmayan o sesin rehberliğiyle ilerlemeye ve öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Bunun için varız. Bu yüzden gece geç saatlere kadar lambalarımız sönmez. Elveda demek hem hüzün hem de gurur verir. Her şeyi sorgulayarak ve merakımızı besleyerek, dayanıklılığımızı test ederek, sınırlarımızı aşarak, ilerleyerek ve yeni ufuklar açarak yeni bir yol buluruz. Yeni icatlar çıkararak, kendi yolumuzu çizerek. Burası fikirlerin doğduğu ve yeni fikirleri doğurduğu, bizim de doğduğumuz, birlikte büyüdüğümüz ve yükseldiğimiz yer. Burası Yakın Doğu Üniversitesi.
Good evening. Welcome to the first seminar of the Global Security Seminar series, in which we try to understand what's happening around the world with leading experts in their respective fields. This evening, we are going to be talking about the US presidential election results, the highly anticipated results, which we believe will have significant repercussions and significant consequences, not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the world. Now, after a much turbulent election season, of course, the American public went onto the polls on the 5th of November and elected Mr. Donald Trump as their 47th president. I say much turbulent season, but there's another element to all this, and that is the element of surprise. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the results were a bit of a surprise to quite a few of us, not only because they defied pre-election predictions, which foresaw a somewhat of a knife-edge result, but also perhaps, dare I say, defied some of those seasoned analysts who predicted that the result would be the opposite. Dr. Alan Lichtman here, if he's watching us, indeed was proven wrong, perhaps, dare I say. The other element of surprise was the margin of vote in which the Democratic candidate lost the elections, Ms. Kamala Harris, the largest vote margin of victory for any Republican candidate in over 4 decades for Mr. Donald Trump. So a very, very good result indeed, but also quite a bad result for Ms. Harris when you look at the margin of victory in what we call the blue states. Now, so how did Mr. Trump win, or why did Ms. Kamala lose? What happens next? In order to answer these questions, we have tonight one of the leading experts on US presidential politics, and that is, of course, Professor Stephen Farnsworth from the University of Mary Washington, United States. He is joining us this evening. Now, before I give the floor to my distinguished guest, I just want to highlight, well, some of his achievements from his very extensive CV. I need to stress this, that he's got an excellent CV with excellent, impeccable credentials. Like I said, he is a leading political commentator on subjects ranging from presidential politics to local Virginia congressional races. He's been widely featured in the national media, including the Washington Post, Reuters, the Chicago Tribune, and the MSNBC. Professor Farnsworth is author or co-author of 7 books on presidential communication. His work, Presidential Communication and Character, the White House news management from Clinton and cable to Twitter and Trump, examines how the last 4 US presidents sell themselves and their policies in an ever-expanding and sometimes precarious media environment. Among his other books are The Global President, Spinner-in-Chief, The Nightly News Nightmare, The Mediated Presidency, The Political Support in a Frustrated America, and Late Night with Trump, Political Humor and the American Presidency. So without any further ado, Professor Stephen Farnsworth, welcome to the show. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to our conversation about this very interesting election season that we have just survived. I have a few slides with some data to sort of give us a bit of a framework for our conversation, and so we'll go through those, and then we'll be able to have a talk about what this means and what might be coming next. If we could go to the next slide. When you think about the election this cycle compared to other years, as my colleague mentioned, there was a lot of commentary that the Democrats would prevail. That was a sort of a strange argument to make, given some of the underlying factors that the people who were so optimistic about Democratic prospects were making. I think above all, it's important to remember that the dominant issue in basically every American election, unless the country is at war, is the economy. And the economy had not been going well, at least not how the people saw it. If we look at the macroeconomic numbers for the United States, the numbers were actually pretty good going into this election. Unemployment was very low. The stock market, which measures the optimism that people have about the economy, that was very high at record or near record levels. You look at a lot of other issues that related to purchasing power, increased wages, a lot of macroeconomic numbers that were actually pretty good for the Democrats. But all of that matters less than how people felt about it. And so in public opinion data over and over again, we saw a very, very negative view of the economy and a negative view of Joe Biden. In many ways, America voted for change in 2024. And it votes for change in most elections. If you remember, in 2020, people weren't that happy with Donald Trump, and he was replaced by Joe Biden. In 2016, the Democrats weren't that happy with the Democrats nominated Hillary Clinton that year. The Republicans, though, were offering Trump as a change candidate, and change again was the election dynamic of 2016 and 2020 and 2024. And then, of course, we go back further, and you see the same kind of dynamics in 2008 and 2092. When you look at these elections, you see that there is often a movement for change. I suspect that that is common in a lot of places. I think that when you have really highly competitive politics like we do in the US, when Democrats win, they don't win by a lot. When Republicans win, they don't win by a lot. There's a lot of shift movement from one party to the other, and people are often very frustrated and imagine it could be better with somebody else. Americans are very optimistic people that way, by the way. We think that the world can be better if we just simply change the leadership. Now, what I have on this slide is the dynamic of this election compared to some recent elections. So if you look at the Electoral College votes, you can see that the margin that Trump had in this election was of 86 electoral votes. That's a bit higher than Biden had or that Trump himself had 8 years ago, but it is lower than, say, the two Obama elections before that, or the two Clinton elections going further back to the 1990s. The electoral vote is all that matters, but if you're curious about the popular vote, I have that number as well. The margin as it stands as of this week, they're still counting some ballots and still questions about some ballots. We're looking at a 2.6 million vote margin for Trump over Harris. That's less than half of the margin that Biden had over Trump 4 years ago. And so, as you can see, it's a relatively divided country. When you look at the individual Senate and House races, many of those were also decided by relatively small margins. And so I think over and over again, you can see that America is very close to evenly divided. Circumstances are good for one party in one election, good for another party in another election. If we could move to the next slide, please. When we think about Biden's presidency, I think it will look to be a pretty successful presidency legislatively. There are a number of things that Biden was able to get through Congress. Remember, our political system involves a great deal of autonomy for the legislative branch. The executive does not control Congress, does not often get his way. Even when members of the Congress, the majorities, are of the president's party, things don't necessarily happen the way the president wants. And so when we look at Biden's legislative outcomes, his legislative agenda and what got through, you can see that Biden had a pretty successful legislative program, particularly in his first 2 years. If you look at the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, I have the details here on the slide. What you can see is that this was a wide-ranging series of pieces of legislation designed to put a lot of money into the economy to deal with the economic tumult that was caused by COVID. Remember, the whole world basically shut down. That was a very, very difficult, very threatening environment for a lot of people. How are they going to pay their bills? Are they ever going to work again? Can they be safe going to the grocery store? What have you? And so all of these things coming together required a very significant effort to try to basically restore the health to the economy as we had more vaccines and people were able to go out more. This is something that the Trump administration did too. I don't have it on the slide, but the Trump administration also put forward a big rescue plan during 2020 in advance of the 2020 election to try to keep the economy moving. And if I generally don't feel like the Harris campaign made a lot of mistakes. I think that that if there was one thing they might have done a little bit more of, they could have basically accepted that the public opinion was very negative about inflation in particular and the economy more generally, and leaned into it instead of arguing that there isn't a problem. Because if you tell a voter that what they think is a problem isn't a problem, then you too are part of that problem. And I think that was the big challenge that if the Democrats had asked me for my political advice, I would have said, be more aggressive about talking about inflation, how you're going to deal with it. The Harris campaign, the Biden presidency, they could have said something along the lines of inflation was the only way we were going to prevent a depression caused by COVID. Something like that. And it's painful, but we've got a plan to fix it. We are fixing. Bear with us. Something like that. Instead of just saying, "Well, look at the unemployment rate. Look at the stock market. You're wrong when you think the economy is a problem for you." Now, if we could move to the next slide. In American politics, as I mentioned, we often go back and forth between the two parties, and there is a dynamic not unlike the tide going in and the tide going out. And so what I have on this slide is the incumbent presidential approval ratings right before candidates were looking for a second term in office. And you can see that the higher approval numbers at the top of the slide, these are all presidents who were reelected. Eisenhower, Clinton, Nixon, Reagan, Obama, and Bush. The presidents who weren't reelected, Trump, Carter, and Bush, had much lower public approval numbers. And when Joe Biden basically decided that he would retire rather than run for another term, his approval number was very deep in the not likely to be reelected category. Joe Biden, of course, had a very problematic debate performance going into the summer, and Democrats basically thought that in his 80s he was just too old to run for another term, and Harris was given the mantle, but didn't have a lot of time. She only had about 3 months to build a campaign, and that's not much time at all. And you can see the result. But really, I do think that this election, above all, is an election along the lines of what we call retrospective voting in political science. People look at the economy of the presidential term that's just ended, and they reward or punish the president's party accordingly. If we can move to the next slide. Um, what you see here in this slide is the adjustment of the national election polls going back to the last three election cycles. And so, for example, one of the things that always happens in American politics is that women are more likely to support Democratic candidates and men more likely to support Republicans. And so, what you can see is you look at the 2024 number, the Democratic women the women voted for Democrats by an 8-point margin. That's quite a bit smaller than the 15-point margin of 2020, and it's also smaller than the 13-point margin of 26. Even though there was a woman running on the Democratic ticket, the gender gap, if you will, was less favorable to Democrats in the 2024 election than in the previous two. At the same time, I think Donald Trump was leaning into male voters a lot. He talked a lot about politics in terms of men being threatened or challenged or undermined by the Democratic agenda. And so those kinds of things, I think, really energized a lot of Republican votes from the men in this environment. And as you go down into breakdowns about what kind of men, what kind of women, where the impacts were greatest, I want to draw your attention in particular to the Latino men category. This is a group that Democrats had won by a big margin in 2016 and 2020, but the Republicans had a 12-point margin in 2024. I think that Donald Trump did very, very well in reaching out to Latino men in particular. Trump also cut the advantage for Democrats with Latino women. That is another impact, but it's still an overwhelmingly Democratic electorate when you're thinking about the Latino women. Among African Americans, the numbers didn't change a great deal. This is one of the most Democratic groups of the electorate. Democrats have huge margins when we're talking about African American men and women. When you're looking at America's divide when it comes to the kind of place where people live, you can see that Trump is doing very well with rural voters. Republicans have a 30-point margin in 2024 among people who live in rural communities. That is a significant improvement on the 15-point margin that Trump had 4 years ago when he went up against Biden. The Democratic numbers in urban areas, the metropolitan areas, the big cities, a little bit smaller than it was the case 8 years ago, but still, a significant dynamic here. So when you're thinking about where Harris didn't do as well as Biden 4 years earlier, a couple of key things to remember. There was an enthusiasm gap. The number of votes cast for Harris was smaller than the number of votes cast for Biden. So there were people who chose to participate and then chose not to participate 4 years later. Then you see, of course, the dynamic with Latino men on this slide and the growing strength of Republicans in rural areas. If we can move to the next slide. Here we see a significant issue when we're thinking about the dynamics of age and of education. The issue here, as you're looking at the top slide, traditionally the under 30 voters are a very, very Democratic group. They were less pro-Democratic this election cycle than in the past. And that's another area where Harris didn't do as well as Biden. When you're looking at the issue of college education, increasingly the Democrats win people with college educations, but they lose and lose by a significant margin white voters who do not have a college degree. This is the core of Donald Trump's support. There are a lot of Americans who are very, very worried about the economic future for their families and their communities. Many of them are concentrated in the industrial Midwest. But the reality is that that anxiety for people without college degrees is particularly strong and pervasive across the country. This is why, and we can talk about this more in the question and answer, why protectionism, why the idea of limiting trade is so popular in the American political context. There's a great deal of concern that globalization has robbed Americans of a lot of well-paying jobs, particularly jobs that would be the kind of employment that white working class voters would have. So there is a great concern about globalization that has animated Trump's rise and his campaigns all the time that he's been in public life. Speaking of which, I want to point at the bottom of the slide to the economy question, and you can see here that that there is an overwhelming support for the out candidate, the party not in power. In each of these three elections, when the Democrats were in the White House, the people who thought the economy was not very good, overwhelmingly Republican voters. When in 2020, people who thought the economy wasn't good, Trump was president, overwhelmingly Democratic voters. And then, of course, in 2024, the people who thought the economy was not good, overwhelmingly Republican voters. This is what I mean about the tide going in, the tide going out. There is retrospective voting in each of these elections. If we can move now to the next slide. And this is the last slide that I'll show you. But we do want to talk a little bit about issues and character. Now, when you think about American elections, and particularly when I'm talking to an international audience, they often find this hard to grasp. There is really not that much of a conversation about foreign policy. It is not the most important issue for most Americans. And part of that has to do with the dynamics of where we are in the world. I mean, geography is destiny in many ways. And our location with two huge oceans on either side of us and generally congenial neighbors in our area means that most Americans don't think much about foreign policy. Americans don't travel all that much compared to people with similar levels of income. You know, Europeans travel much more than Americans do. The dynamic here is that foreign policy just simply doesn't matter all that much. The one time that it does matter is when America's in war. You know, when we were in Iraq, when we had 150,000 troops in Iraq, then there were a lot of people paying attention to foreign policy. But most of the time, it's not a key issue for us. It's only when there is some sort of dramatic military engagement at the moment or something like 9/11 that foreign policy becomes very significant. The rest of the time, it's down at the bottom of the priority list. In this election cycle, of course, the most important issue for Democrats was the democracy, the question of the threats to democracy that they perceive coming from Donald Trump. And the most important issue for Republicans was the economy, the question about how poorly people felt about how they were doing. And you can see that 34% of the electorate said that democracy was their most important issue, and those people voted 80% for Harris. 32%, almost the exact same number, voted as on the basis primarily on the economy, and those people overwhelmingly Trump voters. Abortion was less significant, but ranked number 3, and that was an advantage for Harris. Immigration, of course, one of the things that Trump has talked a lot about, that's a dynamic where he is able to prevail 90 to 9 in terms of those voters who considered immigration their top priority. Now, at the bottom, when we're talking about candidate qualities, the Trump has a big advantage here on the question of, is he a leader and can he bring change? Those two issues really show a powerful dynamic about what people liked about Donald Trump and what he's going to do. Harris prevailed on the question of which candidate has good judgment and which candidate cares about people. Those were advantages for her, but those issues were a little less significant than the ability to lead and the need for change. And so those are the kinds of dynamics, I think, when you look at this election. When you look ahead to the Trump presidency to come, he takes office in January, we're starting to get some signals about how that's looking for him. It's clear that Donald Trump wanted to push Congress to be more compliant. That's one of the reasons why he put forward very controversial nominees, like his Attorney General nominee, Matt Gaetz, who withdrew yesterday. He found out that the Senate is going to look with scrutiny on his nominees. They're not simply going to rubber stamp everything that he wants. And so Trump has learned once again, as presidents always do, that Congress is going to take care of itself at least part of the time. And that, means that the Trump presidency will have to go through the Senate. And so some of Trump's ideas may not be acceptable to the Senate. Some of his nominees we've already seen are not acceptable to the Senate, and so there may be some disagreement. Even though there's a Republican majority Senate, that doesn't mean that it's a rubber stamp legislature. I think that a lot of the things that Trump said that he was going to do, he will try to do. I would anticipate a pretty aggressive effort to send out of the country people who are not here legally, particularly those who've committed crimes and are otherwise sort of in the system where the government knows where they are and what they've done. And those people who have come into contact with law enforcement are probably the first ones to go. Also, I tend to think that we're going to see a much stricter standard at the border. You're going to see more resources being devoted to the southern border in particular, trying to keep people from crossing illegally. So that's an issue. I think one of the issues that is going to be a little bit more challenging to predict is what to do with respect to the foreign policy crises in Iraq. I mean, not Iraq, in Ukraine. The issue there is one that Trump has often said should not be a war that's continuing. He wants a quick settlement. We'll see how he will get that. That's, I think, uncertain. With respect to the crisis in Gaza, I think what we see from Trump is what we saw from him during his first term. Trump is very pro-Netanyahu, very pro-Israel, and there is little indication that anything will be different the second time around. And so the dynamic of people who thought that a change in the White House would create an environment less favorable to Netanyahu. Well, when you elect Trump, you will get an even more pro-Netanyahu president than Biden was. So I think that in many ways there will be some continuities between this president to come and the status quo, particularly with respect to policies relating to the Middle East. With respect to the other global areas, I tend to think that Donald Trump tends to be more isolationist or unilateralist, and that's a potential problem for the allies in NATO. It's a potential problem for Ukraine that may find some of its support drying up after January 20th. But in order to do full justice to a presidency to come, we do need more than 20, 30 minutes. So we'll leave it there with sort of the highlights of what I think we can learn from this election and what we might look forward to going forward. And the rest of the time that we have together, I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Stephen Farnsworth, for that excellent overview and the breakdown. So I just want to pick up on a couple of your insights, which I think are quite intriguing, especially for us that we're expecting a different result. I mean, for instance, this enthusiasm gap. Let's start with that one. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on that a little bit, and also quite close to the sort of the just I think, if I'm not mistaken, just after the debate, there was much noise from across the country, but also from Michigan. And that issue was also tied to what was happening in Gaza. And the understanding was that Muslim Democrat voters would simply not go to the polls. I wonder if the enthusiasm gap, a part of that enthusiasm gap, is related to that as well, some sort of a protest over what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, in terms of the enthusiasm gap, let me just give you two numbers to set the stage for the answer. Joe Biden received 81 million votes in 2020. And President Harris, our current count has her at 74 million. So that's a significant number that has been lost for the Democrats. And they weren't all simply moving to the Republicans. The Trump number went from 74 million to 76.7. So at least half of that gap between Harris and Biden was people who chose not to vote in this election cycle. And I think part of that is going to be people who are not happy with Trump, but also not happy with Biden. There is what we call a double negative. You don't like either party. You have, in that situation, a great temptation to stay home. One of the things to remember about American politics is we actually have relatively low turnout compared to many of the other nations in the G20. We don't necessarily make it as easy to vote. And we don't necessarily have the kind of turnout that you see in even newer democracies than the United States. That being said, then people choose not to vote for a variety of reasons. I think that there was a significant economic impact in terms of why people chose not to vote. They didn't like Trump. They didn't like the economic policies of the Democrats. That's to be sure. And when you're looking at those swing states, the issues of those electoral college states that were most competitive, in Michigan, front and center on that list, one of the biggest of the 7 states, second biggest of the 7 states that we were looking at. Pennsylvania was the largest swing state. In that case, there was significant efforts on the part of Muslim Americans to stand down in this election cycle. People they weren't very enthusiastic about Trump. They weren't very enthusiastic about the Democrats, and so by staying away from the polls on election day, they voiced their opposition to both parties. But it may have been counterproductive, in all honesty. If Muslim Americans chose the candidate who is most aggressively supportive of Netanyahu, and that is effectively by default what happens when you stand down and you move away from the Democratic Party that you'd supported. Normally, Arab Americans do vote more Democratic than Republican. The reality is a dynamic that the Republicans win, and Netanyahu will have an even greater leverage, or he will have even fewer breaks. I mean, my personal view is that that Netanyahu sometimes doesn't remember in the U.S.-Israeli relationship which country's the superpower. But it's also the case, I think, sometimes that American presidents tend to be hesitant to use the kind of leverage that the United States possesses when it provides that kind of military assistance and political support that it does for Israel. But that's my personal opinion on this particular question.
I think, if I'm not wrong, on his first visit to Israel, Bill Clinton famously said, after a meeting with Netanyahu, who was the opposition, who was in the opposition there, famously said, someone should remind them who is the superpower here. So you are also right in that. The second surprise is on, how well he did amongst the Latino men. When you said that, Trump's campaign really targeted that demographic. And I'm, again, a bit puzzled because on the whole of his discourse on immigration, how did he do so well among Latino men?
Well, of course, it's important to remember that the Latino men who are voting are in the country legally. They've become citizens. So they're not at risk of deportation. Those are people who are in the U.S. They may have been here for generations. And so these are not people at risk of deportation orders. So there is a different kind of dimension politically when you're at risk and when you're not. And if you are at risk of deportation, then you're not a citizen and you're not a voter, and you can't really express your opposition to Trump in any other way than just being mad about it. The advantage that Trump had with Latino men in particular had to do with a lot of the socially conservative messaging that the Republicans put forward. A number of Latinos are very Catholic and are very pro-life. And so a message that the Democratic Party is too aggressively pro-abortion is going to resonate with a more conservative element of the electorate, and Latino men are in that category. Similarly, there was a lot of discussion about trans identity, and that also, I think, played into the idea that the Democratic Party is this party that doesn't represent the core traditional cultural values that would be common in Latino homes. And so when you think about sexual identities and leaning into that policy, when you think about abortion and leaning into that policy, um, you can create an environment, I think, where a lot of Latino voters would say, they have conservative personal values, and the Republicans matched up better with them in that regard. That certainly seems to be the dynamic that I would see to explain this particular challenge for the Democrats. And this is one of the ways in which a lot of people, by the way, sort of struggle in a two-party system. I mean, you end up with a list of things that the Democrats offer, and a list of things that the Republicans offer, and you may agree with half of one list and half of the other. And with two parties, that's really all you get for choices. And so one of the areas that I think that the Democratic Party struggles is by offering up liberal social messages. They sometimes underestimate the extent to which the American electorate is socially conservative. By not saying enough about economic measures, I think Democrats sometimes suffer in another way, because I think that if you were to think about where a lot of these swing voters are, they tend to be socially conservative and economically liberal. And so when Democrats talk about increasing the minimum wage, or making it easier for people to go to college, or giving people a tax break when they buy a home, those are things that I think can connect with voters who are persuadable to the Democratic side. But when you start talking about things like trans rights, you lose a lot more people than you gain, and that is particularly true with Latino men who I think responded to Trump's message with a greater swing than just about any other group in the electorate.
So, socially conservative messaging seemed to have done the trick. Certainly from where we were looking at that discourse, on immigration certainly seemed toxic, and we were expecting that Americans with different cultural identities would react in a more sort of negative way to that sort of messaging of immigrants collecting pets from the streets and that sort of thing. But that's very interesting. Now the other point you raised is on the brakes that the Senate may apply on Trump. Would you say the similar breaks could be the case in terms of his foreign policy? Because I want to press you a little bit on foreign policy as well, if I may.
Yeah, and I do think that's where you'll see the most aggressive employment of disagreements with the Senate and the president. There are a lot of people in the Senate who are much more internationally oriented, much more supportive of things like NATO and American engagement in the world. Historically, remember, this was a two-party dynamic in American politics. For 80 years, from World War II until Donald Trump, Democrats and Republicans consistently agreed that democracy promotion was a core value of the United States, and one that should be supported aggressively. And it didn't matter whether it was a Democrat or Republican president. Everybody at the top level of American politics with any real authority was committed to this international vision of America, an outgrowth of perhaps American isolation and the devastation of World War II that followed that American isolationism between the wars. Now, when you're thinking about Trump, that's completely different. He's the first really isolationist president we've had since the 1920s. It's been 100 years, really, since we had this kind of vision expressed by a president or a president-elect. And that's where I think the Senate is going to say, wait a minute. There's a great concern on the part of a lot of senators about Russia. in particular. Russian aggression is not only a threat to Ukraine, but obviously a threat to the eastern flank of NATO. If you're looking at full disclosure, I had a Fulbright in the University of Warsaw last year, and so I was in Poland, and the country has 1 million Ukrainian refugees in it right now. There are people who are just devastated in terms of their personal lives by what has happened to their communities in the Donbass, in Crimea, even in places far from the front like Kyiv. You're looking at bombing with some regularity, and so there's a great deal of concern that basically Ukraine is an appetizer for Putin, and so there is a Senate view that is going to be much more internationalist than Trump. And so one of the challenges I think that you'll see with Trump is how exactly he can do some of the things that he might want to do. The Senate would never be happy with him leaving NATO, for example. Sure, Trump can push the allies in NATO to move towards that 2%, and he can be pretty combative about it. But there are, I think, certain red lines with respect to international issues that the Senate will not basically bend to Trump's will on those issues. That's not to say that Trump won't get most of what he wants, but there are places I think where the Senate will say no, this won't do, and that it doesn't take all that many Republican senators. Remember, you've got the current Senate, the Senate that takes office in January will be 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. And so if you can find 4 Republicans to say no, and they join with the 47 Democrats who basically will say no anytime 4 Republican senators ask them to, there will be no movement in favor of whatever Trump is trying to do. And so you have to remember that senators, because they have 6-year terms, they're not necessarily pressured by the president. Trump only has 4 years in the White House. And so the people who are elected today, they won't run for election until after Trump is long gone.
Exactly.
And the people who were elected 2 years ago, they don't run until 4 years from now, when Trump isn't on the ballot because of our 2-term limit. And then even the people elected 4 years ago, who only have 2 years left in the term, some of them might retire, and so they don't really care what Trump thinks anyway. And so you're looking at a lot of possibilities, I think, for Trump if he takes a really aggressive stance and refuses to listen to the Senate. Well, the Senate will make him listen.
Excellent. I'm just checking. We have a question from the audience as well. If I may just. Yep. If I may read it out loud so that you can tackle. Oh, there we go. It's on our screen now. So ideologically speaking, Mr. Abdullah Al-Khatiri says, what role did the leftists play in this election? Were they part of the Harris failure, whether because of domestic matters such as not much to contribute to blue-collar workers, or foreign policy in the light of the war in Gaza?
Yeah. There was, I think, a key moment in the Harris campaign when she was asked, what would you do differently than President Biden? And she said, I can't think of anything. She could have said a couple of things. One, she could have said, much more aggressively, the war in Gaza has to stop now. We have to have a ceasefire. That's not a particularly controversial position, but you could say, if I were president, I would push harder for an immediate ceasefire, something like that. She could have said, as I mentioned before, Democrats support things like a higher minimum wage. She could have said, President Biden and I both agree on a higher minimum wage, but I think of it's more of a priority, and so I will emphasize it more than he has. These are issues where she's not really departing from the Biden vision. She's not presenting herself as disloyal. She's just saying there are certain areas where there is some nuance. And if she had done things like that, I think she might have been able to connect a little bit more with the leftist voters that the questioner proposes were part of the problem for the Harris campaign. I think that's absolutely true. I think that something along the lines of a more aggressive outreach to the left could have been part of the way of encouraging people who look at the two parties and don't see enough to make it worth showing up to vote for either one of them, to have supported Harris a bit more. And I do think that would have worked out a little bit better for her. But it's sort of hard to say that it would have been enough. When people are really worried about the economy, really worried about inflation, that's going to really be much more powerful to a lot of voters than the question of whether, in all honesty, as horrific as the situation in Gaza is, most, Americans don't necessarily have a direct personal involvement, at least most of them, in what happens there. It's a long ways away, and there's not that immediacy that you would feel in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I teach U.S. foreign policy here, and we do sometimes have a chat with the students. And I was trying to get the general feeling of what they think of the results. And quite a few of them are watching us right now. And two issues came up in those discussions. We are talking about students, undergrads. They are in their 18, 19, some of them are early 20s. And one thing that was for them striking was the ages of the two candidates. Well, the original Democratic candidate and Mr. Trump, that they are in their advanced ages. And young people were really having an issue with that over here. They were wondering, why is that so? Why are they, why are there no young leaders? And is this sort of the trend? Is this a feature of U.S. politics, having candidates that were frankly so old? And if we wouldn't have that for an abysmal debate performance, Mr. Biden would probably go on to compete for the presidency.
Yeah, well, let me tell your students that I'm right there with them. I may be 60 years old, but I still wonder when it's our time in American politics. In my whole life, I've only had one president who's been roughly my age, Barack Obama. And so even people in their 60s are raising the question of what is it with these 80-year-olds? Because it isn't just Trump and Biden. It's also Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Bernie Sanders and all the other sort of top tier players in American politics, where they are all notably in their 70s or their 80s. I think that's going to change very rapidly. I think we're looking at a recognition on the part of Democrats that you need to reach out to younger voters, and the way to do that is to offer voters candidates who are closer in age to who they are. This is a challenge, I think, that American politics has struggled with because of demographics. The baby boom generation, those people born immediately after the end of World War II, people who are now in their upper 70s or beyond, these are people who have dominated American politics for a very long time because there were so many of them. The people who were born before the baby boom, the people who were born in the 20s and the 30s, these are people who are a part of a smaller cohort. There just weren't as many of them. And the people who were born after the baby boom, the Generation X is the term that we often use, or the millennials, these are also smaller groups than the baby boomers. And so elections are about numbers. And so for many, many years, the biggest piece of the electorate has been those baby boomers. And their power has dominated as a result of that demographics. Remember, after World War II, people in America were very rich, they were very optimistic, and they had a lot of children compared to the generations that were thinking about whether or not to have children during the Depression, or the generations that were thinking whether or not to have children more recently. So that's part of the dynamic. But passage of time being what it is, there will be a time when baby boomers are less significant because there will be fewer of them. That's already happening, I would argue, and that will only intensify in the years that come. And so the next generation of political figures are already sort of waiting in the wings, and that we will see them more influential, particularly going forward in the next 2, 4, 6 years.
Just on that note, which is my final question, and the second theme that we picked up on with the students here, and that is Mr. Elon Musk. What sort of a role did he play in all this? And should we worry about what he is about to, or what sort of plans he has for the country?
Well, it's important to remember that he does not have an official position in the government, and he doesn't seem likely to have one. I think that that in many ways, the biggest question mark for me about this election is actually what Trump will do with Elon Musk. I mean, in many ways, Elon Musk was very helpful to Trump in the election. On Twitter, or X if you prefer, that was a place where the algorithms were being shifted, where the audience mix was shifting in a way that was very conservative and very supportive of Trump. I'm greatly concerned about disinformation politics. That's a subject completely for another day. It's another hour conversation of its own.
Absolutely.
But certainly the dynamic with respect to social media is that they haven't been very aggressive at countering disinformation. It's good business to have disinformation flourish on their platforms, and so that means that it doesn't get really reined in or stopped. And so for President Trump, who during his years as president, the Washington Post said they've documented 30,000 lies about the Trump year. You know, those lies aren't particularly challenged in places like X. And so certainly Trump has an advantage there in that space of social media, and he used it well. What happens going forward? That's a big question to me. Full disclosure, I've done media development work in Ukraine. I've been there many times. I'm working with journalists about trying to build free society. I used to be a journalist before I was an academic studying the media. So this is one of the things that I've done. And so having spent a lot of time in the region of the former Soviet Union, those various nations, I've been very, very troubled by the extent to which, again, this is a personal view, extent to which Donald Trump doesn't appreciate the threat that Russia poses to the region and to the larger world. That's a personal view of mine. And so one of the things that we know about what's going on in Ukraine right now is that a huge amount of their capacity to defend the country against Russia comes from Elon Musk's Starlink system. And so we have, with respect to Elon Musk, somebody who is dramatically helping the Ukrainian resistance in terms of the ability to use satellite imagery, satellite communications. These kinds of things are really essential for the Ukrainians. And as long as Elon Musk keeps the system up and running and allows the Ukrainians to use it, they're in a better position than if he shuts it down. And so one of the things that I think is really sort of a key question of how the Trump administration will deal with Ukraine is not just the Trump administration itself and what Donald Trump wants to say, but also Trump adjacent figures like Elon Musk. What are they going to do? Are they going to continue to provide the kind of basically online infrastructure that is keeping the Ukrainians competitive in a world in which Russia, of course, has far more resources and manpower than Ukraine does? It's a much bigger country, and Ukraine is fighting a difficult environment with the size of its country versus Russia.
That's you are absolutely spot on, and I will definitely second that. Right, Professor Stephen Farnsworth, that's all the time we have for this evening. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights with us on this really topical but also a difficult topic, and that is probably going to be staying with us for some time. Not least because of the particular developments that you mentioned that are happening as we speak. And we are, of course, going to be watching very closely what happens not only in the US, but also in Ukraine as well. Right, and for the people who are watching us in their homes or at work, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And make sure to follow the Nearest Institute on social media to stay informed with all the updates and upcoming events. Thank you and good night.